Hey guys, as we take on Key Concept 4.3, talking about the diverse intellectual and cultural movements that emerged during the 20th century. Keep in mind that in the post-World War I period, uh, the New World created an age of anxiety. World War I was a staggering blow to Western civilization, and many people felt as if the world they knew had been turned upside down. Um, and people really saw themselves living in an age of continual crisis, at least until the early 1950s. And so keep in mind, once again, World War I, the revolution at the end of the war, the political and financial crises of the 20s and 30s, the Great Depression, World War II, and the onset of the Cold War just changed society, changed ideas, changed thought. And the first part of this key concept focuses on the fact that this belief in progress that was characteristic of much of the 19th century began to break down before the First World War, and then the experience of war just intensified that sense of anxiety. And as we get started, I want to talk first about this beginning of the breakdown even before the war. Um, as we stated earlier, during the last period, period three, World War I began. Europeans were generally confident in the ability of science. They were confident in technology to address human needs. But there were some problems with the uncertainty created by the new physics and psychology. And some examples of this can be seen in the ideas, of Friedrich Nietzsche. He was probably one of the most important critics of the rationalism of the Enlightenment. And kind of, he blasted religion and famously claimed God is dead, and is going to be kind of a predecessor uh, to the existentialist movement that's going to come afterwards. He had claimed Christianity embodies a slave morality and this glorified weakness, envy, and mediocrity, and that individualism had been quashed by society. Um, Freud agreed with these, and Freud, himself agreed that the mechanisms of rational thinking, of traditional moral values, can be too strong on the human psyche. And one of Freud's ideas of this whole repression of sexual desires was a part of this, and it crippled individuals. And one of the results of this was that after World War I, the popular interpretation of Freud reflected and encouraged growing sexual experimentation, particularly among middle class women. And so, thus, we see the framework. But the effects of the war are going to give, rise to the movements of existentialism and postmodernism. And existentialism largely was born out of this desperation by both world wars, and inspired by a sense of meaningless. The two names to associate are Jean-Paul Sartre as well as Albert Camus that best represent this movement. And the beliefs were, that for the most part, there's an absence of God in the universe, and meant that humans had no preordained destiny. They were utterly alone, with no future, no hope, and thus they had to determine their own fate. They exist first, and then afterwards they define. If you remember back when we talked about Descartes, I think, therefore I am, Albert Camus is known for I think, therefore I exist. And ultimately, as stated by Sartre, man is nothing but what he makes of himself. This is going to influence the postmodernist era as well in post 1945. And postmodernism, according to most technical definition, it was just a broad movement that's applied to literature, art, philosophy, architecture, and so forth. And we're going to talk later about the architecture. But it was a reaction, to that assumed certainty of scientific or objective efforts to explain reality. And once again, showing that, the idea of the objectivity was being challenged. The scientific objectivity was being challenged during this period. Science and technology also during this time yielded, pretty impressive material benefits, but once again caused immense destruction and posed challenges to objective knowledge. So, if you go back, we had already spoke about the new physics, and that those were challenges to the Newtonian universe, this whole new physics. And it also, we're going to see during this period, as we go on, some example of physicists that are going to continue um, the works of Max Planck and Einstein. So a brief reminder, Albert Einstein, theory of relativity of time and space challenged Newtonian ideas. And, he felt that matter and energy were interchangeable, and even a particle of matter contains enormous levels of potential energy. Planck had developed the basis for quantum physics around 1900, and also postulated that matter and energy might be different forms of the same thing. And both of these guys shook this foundation, and these works will continue into the period post 1914. There are several people that you could use as your case study. I would probably pick Werner Heisenberg and Enrico Fermi. Heisenberg introduced the principle of uncertainty, and as it is impossible to know the position and speed of an individual, it is therefore impossible to predict its behavior. And the principle basically said that the dynamics of an experiment alters the state of the subject. Enrico Fermi, developed the world's first nuclear reactor, and his work later led to the development of the atomic bomb. And so we see this, ultimately these ideas and the impact was that the new universe was very strange and troubling. It was uncertain, undetermined, and physics really no longer provided easy, optimistic answers, especially, with the fact that weapons could be used for mass destruction. Additionally, medical theories and technologies are going to extend life, but are going to pose some social and moral questions. A couple of the issues, for example, with the increased use of birth control. Keep in mind that the Catholic Church opposed birth control, yet by the 1960s, we'll see the invention of the birth control pill, which is going to contribute to the sexual revolution. Another issue that is quite debatable, that's going to pose moral dilemma, was the issue of abortion. The Soviet Union will legalize abortion almost immediately, and many of the other European countries will legalize abortion in the post-World War II period, but causing great debate amongst religious traditionalists. There was also, the idea of genetic engineering. The first clone was a sheep named Dolly. I believe that was in Britain. And then, the idea of eugenics, which, wanted to improve the quality of human race through higher rates of reproduction among superior human society. Interestingly, this began in Britain, spread to the U.S., other Western European countries, but eugenics really became associated with Nazi Germany and its mass sterilization and mass murder of physically and mentally handicapped people, and the attempt at basically the mass extermination of undesirable peoples. And so these ideas are going to, help to extend life, these medical theories, but they are also going to pose these dilemmas, what to do. And finally, keep in mind, I said earlier, military technologies made possible industrialized warfare, genocide, nuclear proliferation, and the risk of global nuclear war increased throughout the 20th century. Not only do we see genocide during the Holocaust, but we'll see genocides later on in Cambodia during the 1970s. We'll see it again in the Sudan during the 2000s. We'll see it, of course, at the cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s, and other areas as well. Next part of this key concept focuses on organized religion and how it continued to play a role in European social and cultural life, despite the fact that there are challenges of military conflict, modern secularism, and rapid change. So, a little bit about religion during this period. The key concept talks about challenges to totalitarian regime, and there were some challenges to the Nazis. But I'm going to pick at my case study the one that I think will be the best example, the challenge to communism posed by Pope John Paul II. And interestingly, communism introduced atheism to most countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, and the legacy of communism resulted in a very decreased role of religion in Eastern Europe, even through today. Pope John Paul II challenged totalitarian communism in Poland in the 1970s. I think we'd already talked about this earlier, but it was his ideas that inspired solidarity. Keep in mind, of all the satellites, Poland remained very Catholic. And so we do see the fact that he is able to challenge world opinion, to be supportive of solidarity. And, ultimately, as Solidarity wins those first elections in Poland in 1989, and Wałęsa is elected the first president during these free elections, much due to this influence and this challenge by Pope John Paul II that constantly was calling out the evils of communism and totalitarianism. Also regarding religion, we're going to see the modernization of the Catholic Church at Vatican II. 1962, this was summoned by Pope John the 23rd, and ultimately it was the most important council of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent, which had basically addressed the Protestant Reformation. There were several interesting things, or interesting results of this. First of all, it was declared that Scripture was the foundation of the church, and it allowed for the use of vernacular in the liturgy. Prior to 1962-63, this time period, the Mass was said in Latin, and that changed to local languages. In addition, it declared that although the Catholic Church was the one true church, that you didn't have to necessarily be Catholic to go to heaven. Other Christian groups that shared a belief in Christ not only to be respected, but they were to be considered separated brethren that had the same basis of ideas. There were still other tenets that kept Protestants and Catholics separate, but ultimately this modernized the Catholic Church. It allowed for several ideas to come forth while maintaining certain traditional Catholic beliefs that still alienated many. Ideas such as birth control, clerical celibacy, women priests, and Pope John Paul II later on reasserted these traditional beliefs as well. And finally, we're going to see increased immigration alter Europe's religious life during this period. We're going to see a huge influx of immigrants from North Africa and Turkey, especially, and this is going to result in a high Muslim population in countries such as France and Germany. And, to help you to understand this and how it came about, there was the dramatic increase during that Western European economic miracle meant that more workers were needed. And combine that with the end of the baby boom and significant numbers of immigrants from the Balkans, from Turkey and North Africa met the demands. Many of them did not return home, but they also, particularly in France, remained unassimilated in their new countries. West Germany gained about 4.5 million immigrants. About half of them were Turkish. Britain received a significant number of immigrants from India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and Africa from their former territories. And the French received the largest share of immigrants from Algeria. I think we talked about that earlier, as well as from some of the other former African colonies. And, eventually we're going to see, rising xenophobia in these nations. It's a concept we'll talk about in the next key concept 4.4. But, pressures are going to really mount on governments to put restrictions on immigrants, a trend that continues through today. The next part of this key concept focuses on the arts, and that they were defined by experimentation, self-expression, and the increasing influence of the United States. And these new movements are going to, demolish the existing aesthetic standards. They're going to explore the subconscious, once again, that influence of Freud, and, satirize Western society and its values. And so key concept guide, you're not required to know all three that I'm about to speak. Really, one will be enough, but I'm going to go over three of them very briefly that I find interesting that could be used with as examples of good modern art. And so we're going to start first with Cubism, and perhaps the most important artist of not just the Cubist era, but the 20th century is probably Pablo Picasso. He was one of the originators of Cubism, and it concentrated on just complex geometry of zigzagging lines, sharply angled overlapping planes. You can see an example in Guernica, which is on the bottom right-hand corner in this particular slide. And this mural of Guernica that portrayed the bombing of the Spanish city during the Spanish Civil War by the German Luftwaffe, was one of the quintessential artworks of this age. It portrayed the suffering and death. It's believed that the horse in this picture represented the dying people of Spain during the war, and that the torch to the right of the horse represented freedom. And the fact that the British and the French were not involving themselves and not helping the Spanish Republic. Another example is that of Dadaism, and Dada itself is a nonsensical word. And it mirrored basically a post-World War I that no longer made sense. It was founded in Switzerland, I believe, in 1916, when I believe it was Marcel Duchamp wrote a manifest against manifests. And basically, it was an art movement that it attacked all accepted standards of art, behavior, poetry, and it just kind of delighted in outrageous conduct. One of the early pieces was when Duchamp took a public bathroom urinal and named it the Fountain as a way of, mocking traditional artistic standards. Another of Duchamp's artwork was the Mona Lisa, painted a mustache and goatee on it. Up on the left-hand corner is another example of Dada art, And I always compare Dada art, if you've ever watched the TV show Seinfeld. Seinfeld was a show about nothing, and Dada is a movement about nothing. Like I said, the first manifest was against manifest. The poetry was nonsensical, and it was meant to be this way. And finally, surrealism. And the most important artist of this movement was Salvador Dali. Um, probably most influenced by Freud's emphasis on dreams. Dali work is down your left-hand side on the bottom here. And it basically is a fantastic world of wild dreams, complex symbols, where watches melt and, giant metronomes beat time and impossible alien landscapes, you know, and I think this is, like I said, the persistence of memory, this particular print as well. And so we'll see these ideas and, the way they're influenced by Freudian psychology, they're influenced during this age of anxiety and just part of it during the time period. As far as architecture during this time period, we're also going to see some pretty uh, impressive changes. So one of the first is the Bauhaus movement. Walter Gropius broke sharply with the past in the design of different things, and these generally were clean, light, elegant buildings of glass and iron. The Bauhaus movement is actually the top right picture, and it kind of represented a jump into the middle of the 20th century. Interestingly, the Nazis viewed this as degenerate, and modernism emerges from this. A good example is the bottom picture there. And finally, postmodernism, which example is in the top picture right there as well, this whole idea that we talked about earlier regarding that. Finally, the ideas of music. And once again, I would pick one of the two to know about. There's uh, Igor Stravinsky. That was, perhaps one of the most important composers of the 20th century. His Rite of Spring experiment with new tonalities and aggressive primitive rhythms. This was actually even before the First World War. And then Arnold Schoenberg, uh, that also, included the 12-tone technique. And, the style of music for the most part was an extreme abstract expressionist style as well. Writers also challenged traditional literary conventions, questioned Western values during this time period, and addressed controversial social and political issues. And so some of the writers, once again, that I would pick to know about, number one, Franz Kafka on the bottom left here. Um, he generally portrayed helpless individuals destroyed by inexplicable, hostile, and surreal forces. Probably his best known work is the Metamorphosis in 1915. Erich Maria Remarque, known for All Quiet on the Western Front in 1929, which was a powerful novel that basically displayed the horrors of trench warfare during World War I. And then, of course, we talked earlier about Sartre and the ideas of existentialism. The last part of this key concept focuses on, increased imports of U.S. technology and popular culture after World War II generated both enthusiasm and criticism. Certain examples of this, the television and American television shows, music such as Bruce Springsteen, and many other Americans have these huge tours in Europe. Even like when the Berlin Wall came down, David Hasselhoff, an American musician who's really quite terrible but loved in Germany, went and sang, had a concert at the Berlin Wall. The introduction of Levi's. And this generated both enthusiasm and criticism. Enthusiasm during this age of new consumerism and excitement towards it, but also criticism, the fact that many Europeans felt that American culture was overtaking their own such culture. And there was a certain resentment towards the influx of American, not just consumer goods, but American ideas into European life. And our last key concept, 4.4, will focus on the experiences of everyday life.